chapter 12. We're going to be looking at multiple passages, but it's all going to happen sort of in order, going through the book of Genesis. I thought we would look at a theme for the book instead of a particular passage. So hopefully you will actually open a Bible up to the book of Genesis. I'm looking at a young man. He's thinking I'm not looking at him. Yeah. All right. So we're going to look at the theme of trust in the book of Genesis. And if you have comments or questions, please feel free to speak up. But we're beginning in, whoa, there it is. We're beginning in chapter 12 because the person who sort of is at the forefront of the theme is Abraham. Of course, chapter 12 is where God comes to Abraham and he says to him, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you, or through you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So here we have, this is, as far as we know, the very first time that Abraham hears anything from God. I guess actually at this point in his life he's called Abram. The first time he hears anything from God. And the very first thing he hears from God is what? What? Get out of town. Yeah, get out of town. Specifically to the place that I will show you. At West Broward, I've been doing like a study with the young families through the book of Abraham, and when we got to this passage, they found it very interesting that God never tells him where he's going. He never tells him where he's going, and he never actually tells him that it's going to be a good place, right? He just says, "I'm going to show it to you." And Abraham has to trust God. Leave the place that he's known his entire life, the place where he has been building his family, building his wealth, and pack it all up and just walk out into the desert. And if we get all the way through the book of Genesis, we're going to see that his grandson is asked to do the very same thing at the very end of his story. Just take everything you have, everything you've been accruing, and leave the place that you've known for your whole life and just pack it up and go out into the desert. That's exactly what he asked Jacob to do, too. Of course, Jacob knew that he was going to Egypt. Abraham didn't know where he was going. So, Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he left from Haran. By the way, did you know that God didn't come to Abram when he was in Ur? He left from Haran because his father is actually the one who packed up and left Ur. I didn't know that until I was 21. I thought he had left Ur, that God called him out of the land of the Chaldeans, which is Babylon, and in fact, it was his father Terah who left Ur and then didn't make it all the way into Canaan and settled halfway there in a place called Haran. So Abram leaves Haran and he takes with him his wife, verse 5, and Lot, his brother's son, and all the possessions that they had gathered, all the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place called Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were in the land. When God brought Abram to Canaan, it was the land that God intended for him, right? But there were still people living there. And it wouldn't be 440 years until Abram's family would actually own the land. Canaanites would be living there all through Abram's life, all through Isaac's life and Jacob's life, all through the time that Israel was in Egypt, and then only in the time of Joshua, 440 or so years later. I think it's a bit more than that because the countdown begins when Abram dies, that his family would actually own the land. So not only did Abram leave his home not knowing where God is leading him, but just having to trust that God is leading him to a place where he will prosper. But when he shows Abram the place, he says in verse 7 that this is the land that I'm going to give your descendants. He can't own it yet. He has to still trust God. This is what the Hebrew writer says when he mentions Abram or Abraham along with all of the other people who died having not yet seen the promise fulfilled. Abraham never owned the land. He eventually owned a small piece of it, right, where he buried Sarah at, I forget what it's called. It's a very significant name. Oh no, but he bought a parcel of land so he could bury his wife, and that became the family burial ground all the way through the days of Jacob. But other than that, he owned none of it. And Isaac would own none of it. And Jacob would own none of it. And it wouldn't be until Joshua that Israel actually took possession of this land that was promised so long ago to their forefather Abraham. So it's a big thing about trust. The whole thrust of Abraham's story is whether or not he's going to trust in God. And before anybody gets to thinking that Abraham or Abram is just a man of perfect faith and trust in God, immediately after he comes into the land, we get in verse 10 of chapter 12 that a famine hits the land that he's living in, and in response, he goes down to Egypt. This might not seem problematic at first, but if the whole idea, the whole matter is whether or not he's going to trust in God, then what does this show you? Times got hard, and so Abraham did what? He went out on his own. He went his own way. He goes to Egypt. Now, Egypt, because of the Nile River and how it floods and recedes regularly, they always have enough food for them and extra because that's just the river going up and down at regular times a year makes it possible to grow food even in such a harsh climate. So they always have food even in times of famine. So Abram, as well as probably many other people, were going down to Egypt. And while he's in Egypt, he is afraid that the Egyptians are going to see his beautiful wife. By the way, how beautiful must you be to be so beautiful that people would murder your husband in order to have you when you are 65 years old? Very beautiful. He's afraid that they're going to murder him so that they can take his wife Sarah, or Sarai at this point. And so who remembers what he asks her to do for him? Say you're my sister. By the way, is that a lie? Not exactly, right? We learn when he's talking to Abimelech later in his life, that's a Philistine king, that he does the same thing and he gets caught in much the same way. And he says, well, it's not exactly a lie. She is my half-sister. She's not from the same mother as me, but she's my half-sister, and so I didn't really lie. But, even if it's a half-truth, it's still meant to deceive someone, right? She is his wife. And if someone comes up and says, is this your wife? And you say, she's my sister. Even if it's true, what they asked you about is whether or not she's your wife. So he lies and shows that not only when times get hard is he not willing yet to trust God, but also when it seems like there's a potential risk to his life, he is not ready to trust God yet. So he has some highs and he has some lows. Him actually leaving Haran and going off to the land that God would show him, that's a high point in his faith, his trust in God. But then we get an immediate low point when he leaves for Egypt and he lies and he gets in trouble for it, of course. But Pharaoh sends him away. He sends him back to the promised land. And then we get in chapter 13. We have the whole argument happening between not Abram and Lot, but their shepherds, their servants. There's not enough space in the land, which, if you don't understand that people were living in the land at the time other than them, that strikes you as odd, because later the entire nation of Israel can live in the land and not have to fight each other. But there were the Canaanites and the Perizzites and the Amalekites and the Hittites and all of those ites living in the land, so they're taking up all the space. So Abram and Lot, their herdsmen start having this conflict because there's still people living in the land that God told Abram to live in. So Abram says to Lot, you probably remember his deal that he makes. Lot, the entire land is before us. You go one way, I'll go the other, and we can part on good terms. We're family, we don't have to fight. So you turn left, I'll go right. You go right, I'll go left. So, of course, Lot leaves. The family essentially splits up, and this presents a problem because God didn't only promise Abram that he would give him this land, he also promised Abram that he would give him what? Children, right? Descendants. A whole nation of descendants. But Abram didn't have any children. So if you are a man who had no children, but you had a nephew, by the way, Haran, Abram's brother, died before God spoke to Abram for the first time. So Haran's son, which is Lot, has become Abram's, essentially his adopted son. So if you are a man and you have all this stuff and you know someone needs to inherit it, and you have a nephew who no longer has a father, then that nephew is your heir, right? So when Lot's herdsmen and Abram's herdsmen butt heads and they have to part ways, all of a sudden, the person who Abram thought was going to be inheriting all of his stuff and carrying on the promise that God made to him has to leave. Do you think that would shake your faith? That would shake your trust? If your faith and your trust all hinged on this promise that God made you, do you think that would shake your faith? But curiously, God's response to this is, well, first off, he doesn't show Abram a sign, right? Whenever someone has their faith wavering, sometimes people ask for a sign that God is still there, or that God's promises are still, he's still good for them. But the way that the Lord responds to this happening in Abram's life is in chapter 13. It's in verse 14. It says, "Lift up your eyes and look now from the place where you are. Look north and south and east and west. All the land that you see, I'm giving it to you and to your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dusts of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered. So get up, walk in the land through its length and its width, because I am giving it to you." So I guess this is sort of a sign for him, but it's not a miraculous sign. God says to Abram, get up and do some traveling. I want you to walk all over this land that I said I'm giving to you, and I want you to see it. I want you to see it. This is the assurance of my promise. I'm going to give you all this land, and I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the dust of the earth. Probably calling one's mind back to when God first made the first man, Adam. He formed him out of the dust of the earth. Have you ever tried to count the grains of sand on the seashore? When I was a kid and I first heard, I believe this one is actually from Genesis 15, but when I first heard that God's promise to him was that his children would, or his descendants would be as numerous as the sand on the seashore. And I was a little kid, and I lived in South Florida, so we went to the beach a lot. And so, much to my parents' confusion, I would just be like looming over the beach, and I would just be like trying to count grains of sand and see if I could do it. Of course, I was only 5, and so I could only count to 50. So that never worked. But to say that his descendants would be as numerous as the dust of the earth is to say that you wouldn't be able to even count them. It would be way too much, way too many. So Abram moves his tent, and he went and dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and he builds an altar to the Lord. He builds an altar to the Lord, this act of devotion and showing that he still trusts in God. So here, even though it certainly called into question his faith in God, when God comes to him and he reinforces this promise, God has another high point in his trust in God, following him returning from his low point, which was in Egypt. And then we have in chapter 14, Lot gets sort of caught up in a war that's going on. He becomes a prisoner of war, and Abraham has to go and save him. And when he's on his way back, he encounters the king of a city called Salem. And his name is Melchizedek. If you have ever pronounced it Melchizedek, that's okay. But it's actually Melchizedek. And this king Melchizedek is also apparently a priest of God, which is not ever explained how or why. But he's a priest of the God Most High. And Melchizedek comes out and he blesses Abraham. He gives him a blessing from God. And Abraham gives him a tenth of everything he has. And then a different king comes. It's the king of the city of Sodom, which is one of the cities that was involved in this whole war. It's one of the belligerents. And the king of Sodom comes to Abraham. Instead of bringing a blessing from God, he comes to bring like a deal. Let's make a deal. And he says, this is in chapter 14, verse 22. Chapter 14, verse 21. The king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself." So the invading army, they had taken people they were going to make them as slaves, and the king of Sodom comes and he says, Abram has just completely won the battle himself, right, with the people that came from his household. And so he comes to Abram and he says, "Give me all the people, and you take all the stuff." Essentially, give me all of the slaves, and you take all of the spoils of war. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I've raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from even a thread to a sandal strap, and that I will not take anything that belongs to you, lest you should say, 'I have made Abram rich,' except only what the young men have eaten and the portion of the men who went with me." And he lists his allies from Hebron who went with him. So this deal that the king of Sodom wants to make is easy money, right? It's easy money. You want to enlarge your possessions, Abram? How about you just let me take all the people, and you can take all of the money? But Abram had made an oath to God that he wouldn't take anything that belonged to the king of Sodom, because if he did, well then it could be claimed that the king of Sodom is the one who made Abram rich. But as it stands, who is the one who made Abram rich? God. And the same goes for Isaac and Jacob later. Both of them have people remarking how God has blessed you. He's made you rich. More rich than the king that you live next to, and then in Jacob's case, more rich than his father-in-law who tried to cheat him out of everything he owned. Kind of the same way that Jacob cheated Esau out of everything he owned. It's the irony there. So that's another high point for his trust in God. I'm not going to trust the easy money. I'm not going to take the easy money. I'm going to trust that God is going to make me prosper. And of course, God does. But, sometimes nowadays, especially if you own a business, it can be very easy to see an offer of easy money, but you have to compromise on something to do it, right? This is totally random, but we were watching a documentary last night with John and Tammy about Jim Henson, and there was a part where it talked about how he got into advertising with the Muppets, and that he hated doing that because that's not at all what he thought it was all about. He thought it was about being creative, and it was about making a difference in people's lives, and he hated having to use them for advertising. And he even mentions that he took coins and stuff, and he made what he jokingly referred to in his office as the altar to money. And he always had this thing going on in the background of his skits in that time of his life, where he was very resentful that he had to make compromises for the sake of making money. And it just goes to show that sometimes when you own a business, it can be very easy to slip into compromising what it's all about in order to make easier money. And it's even more easy to do that when it comes to compromising your beliefs, compromising what the Bible says is right, especially in a culture climate, that says that if you don't affirm what people believe about themselves, even if it's wrong, then you will lose all of your business. You know what I'm talking about? And so it can be fearfully easy to slip into that and compromise on what the Bible says is right in order to, secure yourself financially. And that would be a low point in someone's faith in God. But instead, Abram shows the opposite. He's not going to take the easy money. He's not going to compromise on what he has promised God. Instead, he's going to trust God. And God would make him prosper. He would trust that he would have all that he needed. Then in chapter 15, we have him make a comment when he's talking to the Lord. And he says, "Lord God, what will you give me, seeing as I go childless, and the heir of my house is this guy named Eleazar of Damascus?" Now it's debated as to whether or not that's a reference to someone who was born in his household, like a servant, or if that was like a saying, like some guy who lives somewhere else, like I don't even know him. Sort of like Downton Abbey, where both of the heirs die in the Titanic, and so the guy who's going to inherit all of the estate is some guy that they've never met. That's what Abraham is afraid of, that who's going to inherit all of his stuff? It's going to be some dude that he's never met, or it's going to be some guy who is not even actually part of his family. That's a low point for his trust, right? But in that same passage, we get God reinforcing the promise that he's going to make his descendants as numerous as the sand on the seashore and as numerous as the stars in the night sky. If you go out at night, probably not in a city, but if you go out at night in the countryside and you try and count all the stars, I mean, when there's no light pollution and it's nighttime, you can just see galaxies of stars. There's no way you would be able to count them. What God is saying is, it doesn't look like it's going to work from your perspective, but you can still trust me. He says, this man who you're mentioning, Eleazar of Damascus, the unknown person, right? Like, I don't even know him. He's not going to be your heir. He's not going to inherit your estate. One who will come from your own body shall be your heir. Now, Abram at this point is in his 70s. Is there anyone in their 70s here? I don't want to embarrass you, right? But you understand that when you've hit your 70s, your time of having children is like behind you, right? I think everybody understands that. He's in his 70s. His wife would be, if he is 75 or so, his wife would be 65. And so that is also, childbearing time is behind her. So the promise that a child would come from his own body, like your actual son will be your heir. That is a huge promise. And yet, this is the same passage where we get verse 6, where he says, he believed the Lord, and he, God, accounted it to him for righteousness. Paul uses that quote a lot. Abraham believed God, and God accounted it to him for righteousness. That what we are justified through is not how well we keep the law or how perfect we are in our actions, but it is if we trust God or not, if we're trusting him or not. And so, and of course you can't run wild with that concept, or else you'll get outside of the bounds of the Bible, but it is saying what matters in the end is that you are trusting God and that you're following him with your trust. And so that low is turned into a high for Abram.
Isn't that way for all of us?
Indeed. Indeed.
We are Abraham.
I think that's exactly the point.
We are Abraham.
We all have the promises that God has made concerning our hope of life, eternal life in Christ. And at certain points, it can get really hard to keep that in mind, right? We have so many things that go on in our lives, whether you are a young person or a wiser person. You have so many things that happen in your lives that can take your mind away from it. But it is always healthy to come back to the promises that God has made, the way that he did it for Abram here, and reflect on the hope that we have waiting ahead for us. And we might not understand how it's all going to work, but then again, our job is not to understand everything. Our job is to trust God. Yes?
You kind of skipped over verse 1 in chapter 15, but at the end of that, it says, he's just been through all this stuff with the king of Sodom. God came to him and said, I am your shield, your exceedingly great reward. That's our treasure. That is what we strive for, is that relationship with the God.
Yes. The God who said, I'm the one who defends you, and I'm the one who makes you prosper.
And that's where Abraham can get his faith.
Yes.
Is knowing that the reward is God. And God is going to make it happen no matter what happens around him.
And he does not know what that reward's going to be.
Well, God told him what that reward would be.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
But
At least that part of it, yeah.
But he didn't trust it.
At times, no, he didn't.
And so I think it applies to all of us that each of us
Yeah.
That we lose the short-sightedness to the long-sightedness, and having never owned a business, well, for a long time, I think I personally see that if I don't trust the relationship, but it takes two entities to trust.
Hmm.
And we give Abraham a hard time, but I think in this day and age, it's very easy to forget all of the things around us, that if we get distracted by whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
and we can sit in these pews and have the same thought that we have the knowledge, and yet not recognize God for who he is and reconcile our own inadequacies to
Mm.
what God does. And within that moment of recognizing that relationship, we have true reconciliation when we admit in humility that we do not have all the answers.
Yeah. Yeah.
But we also look at Abraham, who left the place where he was without knowing where he was going,
Mm-hmm.
he wasn't Jewish, he wasn't anything. So, I mean, he had a lot of great qualities too. But he's like all of us. I mean, we have these moments where we don't trust necessarily.
Yeah. We do. We do. Like how Paul puts it, when he wants to do what's right, he finds that as a rule of thumb, there's something warring inside his body that's going to try and make him do the wrong thing. Whenever he wants to do what God says is right, whenever he wants to trust God and follow him, there is sin living in his flesh that is going to try and pull him in the other direction. And he says a lot of times it wins. You know, Paul had lots of problems, sin and temptations that he still struggled with, and sometimes he still gave in, because we live in that kind of world. You know, we just live in a world that is corrupted by sin, and it still exerts its influence on us. And so sometimes, like you said, because of things that are happening, it is super easy to lose track of the hope that is set before us, and start focusing on the trees instead of the forest. Or what's the other phrase? Getting lost in the weeds. You know? Yes?
And no amount of money was going to take him from his God.
Hmm.
Nothing was going to be able to buy him out.
Hmm.
Money was not important to him. What was important was serving his God.
Yeah,
We can learn from that.
for sure. Yeah, he gave up the easy money. And I like how your wife mentioned, right after he passes on the easy money, then God says, I am your shield and your exceedingly great reward.
Amen.
You know, he would, if he had taken the deal, he would have gotten his own reward. But God here promises an exceedingly greater one. Yes?
I, myself, personally, I marvel at him when he so impressively was going to sacrifice his son because God told him to. That has affected me when I go through times of trials. Now, he can do that. I can do this.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and that's nearer to the end of his life, right? When it's like the final test sort of thing. When God says, I want you to take Isaac. By the way, Isaac is the son that he promised in chapter 15. I want you to take Isaac, your son, your only son, whom you love, and I want you to offer him to me as a burnt offering. Wow. That is, it's sort of the feeling of, wow, Lord, I just got him. And you want me to give him back like this. And like you said, the way that he trusts God in that instance is just so huge. The Hebrew writer remarks that in that moment, Abraham reckoned that God would be able to bring Isaac back from the dead in order to still keep his promises. Now, I want you to consider the context of Abraham and what kind of life he had been living up to the point that God called him to leave his homeland. God didn't come to him while he was in Ur, but Abraham grew up in Ur, which is in Babylon, which we know was just full of idol worshiping. You know, the gods, Bel and Marduk and fill in the blank. And they were all considered to be very capricious, you know. You would pray for rain, and then they would flood your town, you know, that kind of thing. The river would flood, or you would pray for rain, and then there would be a drought, because, I don't know, I guess you prayed too hard, and the gods got annoyed at you. That's how they thought in Babylon. And then, you know, his family is still worshiping those gods when they're in Haran. And the book of Joshua, for Joshua's farewell address in chapter 24, the Lord remarks, I pulled Abraham out of that. When he was on the other side of the river, he was worshiping the gods of his fathers, all of those idols. And I pulled him out of that. When we're talking about how much trust that Abraham had to have in God to trust God's promises, he's coming from a culture where you couldn't trust the gods, but you had no choice, because, like, they're the gods. If you prayed to the gods, you couldn't trust that they were actually going to grant your request, and you couldn't trust that they weren't going to turn it around on you and hurt you for it. Just even more so, the trust that he had in the Lord, that he actually trusted God's promises. And I'm certain that it really comes down to the fact that God took care of him. And whenever Abraham had his low points, like in Egypt or the famine, or, you know, he had his times when his trust in God slips. Pardon me. God doesn't turn his back on him. God doesn't leave him for it. And God doesn't hurt him for it.
Again, are we not like Abraham?
Exactly.
We are in the same boat. We have our own gods. We have, you know, we just have a world that comes way above God. Our own idols.
Yes, we have our own set of gods. Yeah, we have money, right? People just devote their whole lives to money, and then the stock market crashes, you know. And then now all that they've been building their whole lives is gone. And they understand that you can't trust money. Yes?
And we also have kind of the same atmosphere that they had in Sodom, especially in your little city of Savannah. We live in Arkansas. We have another city like that, where it's free thinking, anything goes. People are seeking after all the gods of this world. Like Zodiac, New Age, all this stuff is here.
Yep.
But we're pulled out like Abraham to worship him. And we can connect with those people because they're kind of searching for these gods. Our grandsons were just talking about all the zodiac signs. And, you know, I was born in December and mine is this. And,
Oh, yeah.
and it's like, but our daughter kind of doesn't believe in organized religion, so we're not supposed to say much, or we'll get in trouble. But it's like they're seeking after the same thing that Abraham, I think. Abraham wasn't seeking for it, but we have a choice to make. We can go the way of Abraham's God, which is the true God. And kind of like in the New Testament where they go into the city, you know, the unknown God. Well, I know that God. And we need to let that be known in our community. We know that God, the unknown God.
Yeah.
And not put people down for the way they think, but give credit to the true God.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. The words of the psalmist is, "Come and taste that the Lord is good."
Yeah.
and that is an invitation. You know, you had people in all the different times of Israel's history who were still trying to go after these other gods, the same way that they are now. Whether they acknowledge it as a religious thing or if it's just a secular thing, like going after money or whatnot. But the invitation is, well, come try the Lord, you know? Come try him and see how he works for your life, because he is good.
And we need to lead a life of love so that those people can be attracted to us, so that we
Yep.
can give them the invitation. If we live a bigotry life, you know, I'm not going to accept your idolism or whatever you have, whatever you think, put them down.
You put them off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're never going to want to taste what I have if
Yeah.
I act like that.
Jesus said to be as cunning as a snake, but also as gentle or harmless.
Paul made the
As a
comment,
dove.
as a Jew, I became a Jew.
Mhm.
Gentle, I became a gentle. I mean, he morphed chameleon himself to be able to reach people.
You find someone who is searching for the answers, then you had better color yourself as someone who is searching for the truth as well. Like if you come to someone who is just searching and they feel like they can never find, and you come to them as someone who says, I know for absolute certainty that I know the answers, and then you just come to them with a bunch of proof texts, that's not what that person is going to click with. That's not going to work. But if you come to them as someone who says, you know, I'm a person who is always searching for the truth is what I care about too, let's explore that together, and I think I have a lead. That works, you know, that clicks. That's something that is a very, very helpful tact to take. So I heard the second bell, yes? So that means our class hour is concluded. But thank you for your comments.